Hi, Year 12. What a green video, eh? It's amazing. Right, this is another lesson on ontological argument, looking at a second criticism of Anselm's ontological argument. So we looked at Guanillo and his criticism. We're going to look at a criticism from Aquinas. I should say Aquinas doesn't mention Anselm in his arguments, but he's clearly thinking about the kind of argument that Anselm gives. So you can use it as a criticism, but yeah, just don't make, if you do use it, just make sure you're not saying that, Aquinas criticized Anselm. He criticized the ontological argument. So we're going to look at the criticism that Aquinas gives, and we're going to look at how you can reply to that criticism. This should be a fairly short video, but it is quite a complicated point that he makes. So we're going to begin by looking at a quote from Summa Theologica, which is Aquinas' most famous book, which talks about this. So here he talks about the question of whether God is self-evident, and when we say something is self-evident, we mean it's true by definition, or its truth is obvious. So I suppose what you've got to get your head around here is that when Anselm says that in the ontological argument, Anselm is basically trying to prove that God exists is a self-evident statement. He's trying to say that there's something about God that means he must exist. We don't need any outside proof. And Aquinas wants to criticize this by introducing two kinds of being self-evident. So let's read through what he says, and then I'll kind of pick it apart. So he says, a thing can be self-evident in either of two ways. On the one hand, self-evident in itself, though not to us. On the other, self-evident in itself and to us. A proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the essence of the subject, as man is an animal, for animal is contained in the essence of man. So what does he mean by this first bit? Let's just pick it apart. So he gets into the grammar of things. When he says that it's self-evident if the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So in a sentence, the subject is what the sentence is about. So here the subject is man, and the predicate is either the verb or the description that's given of the subject in the sentence. So man is an animal, the predicate is animal, and the subject is man. Now the idea is that if it's self-evident if the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So is it part of the essence of man that he's an animal? Yes. Part of the definition of man is a kind of animal. So that means that it's self-evidently true. Man is an animal. It's self-evidently true because it's part of the essence of being a man that something's an animal. Now he says, so that's his second category of self-evident. It's self-evident in itself. It's true in itself. And it's true to us because we understand what a man is, and therefore we know that a man is an animal is self-evident. He says, if therefore the essence of the predicate and the subject be known to all, the proposition will be self-evident to all. As is clear with regard to the first principles of demonstration, the terms of which are common things that no one is ignorant of, such as being and non-being, whole and part, and such. We'll just skip over that quite quickly. So what he means there is if everybody knows the essence of the subject and the essence of the predicate, if you know the meanings of the terms in the sentence, then they can be self-evident to everybody because everyone can understand. If everyone knows the definition of man, if everyone knows what the definition of animal is, then it's clear to everyone that a man is an animal. Here's the important part now, so he goes, if, however, there are some to whom the essence of the predicate and subject is unknown, the proposition will be self-evident in itself, but not to those who do not know the meaning of the predicate and the subject of the proposition. Therefore, it happens, as Boethius says, so he's quoting another philosopher, Boethius, that there are some mental concepts self-evident only to the learned. Learned? Is it learned? It means people who are educators. As that incorporeal subjects are not in space. Now, what's he saying here? He's basically saying, if everyone understands what the subject of the sentence means and what the predicate of the sentence means, then everyone can know whether it's self-evident. However, there are some concepts that not many people understand. So only the learned, that means educated people, will know that incorporeal substances are not in space is self-evident. Why? Well, because it is self-evident in itself, because incorporeal substances are non-corporeal. That means non-physical substances, substances that are outside of time and space, and therefore it's obvious that they're not in space. If they're incorporeal, they're not in space. Why isn't it self-evident to everyone? But his point is here simply that a lot of people don't know what incorporeal substances are. If you ask the normal person, no one will have a clue. Most people know what a man is. Most people know what an animal is. Therefore, man is an animal is self-evident to them. Incorporeal substances, not many people know what they are. Therefore, it's not the sentence incorporeal substances are not in space is not self-evident to those people. It is self-evident to those educated people who know what incorporeal substances are. Okay, so far so clear, I hope. Then he comes on to God. Therefore, I say that this proposition, God exists, of itself is self-evident, for the predicate is the same as the subject, because God is his own existence, as will be hereafter shown. Now, because we do not know the essence of God, the proposition is not self-evident to us, but needs to be demonstrated by things that are more known to us, though less known in their nature, namely by effects. What's he saying? So he's saying, in itself, the statement God exists is self-evident, because God will know that part of his definition is that he exists. And, you know, if you had a true knowledge of God, you would know that it was part of his definition to exist. So it is a self-evident statement in itself. However, the problem is, he says, is that it cannot be self-evident to us because we don't understand the nature of God. We understand the nature of a man. That's fine, because we can know it quite easily. We understand, if we're educated, what incorporeal substances are. That's, you know, once it's been explained to you, it's pretty straightforward. But God, we do not know, and this is where he's bringing in the idea of the transcendence of God. God is a being beyond our understanding. Therefore, we can't know as human beings the true definition of God. Therefore, we cannot know that existing is part of the definition of God. And if we don't know that existing is part of the definition of God, then we don't know that God exists is a self-evident statement. That's what he's saying. Now, then he goes to say, the existence of God needs to be demonstrated by things more known to us, namely by effects. So what he's going on to say here is that actually the God's existence, because we can't know the definition of God, just because he's so transcendent and so mysterious to us, we can't know by definition that he exists. He might be able to know that because he knows his own definition, but we don't know that, so we can't prove God's existence that way. So we've got to know his existence through a different way, and that is through his effects in the world. So what he's saying here is we need empirical evidence, and that's why Aquinas tends to use things like the cosmological argument, because that's basically saying the existence of the universe is evidence for God's existence, or the teleological argument, which would be the idea that the existence of design in the universe and purpose in the universe is evidence for God's existence. In that case, we're moving from things that we can understand and using that to work out the existence of God. We go from evidence that we can see and understand, work out the existence of God. Ontological argument, he says, does not work, because yes, God might be self-existent to himself. It might be self-evident that he exists if we really knew the existence of God. But the problem is, it's a non-starter because we cannot know the definition of God. You can't say God exists by definition if you don't know what the definition of God is. And because God is transcendent and mysterious to us, we don't know the definition of God. Okay, I've talked about that a lot. Those are his, put it in my words. So here we go. I'm going to talk it through in my words. If a statement is self-evident, it means that we can know that it is true just by reading the statement. That's what self-evident means. It's true just by definition. E.g., squares have four sides. This is self-evident because having four sides is part of the definition of a square. You know already that a square has four sides. You don't need to look at examples of squares to decide. If we didn't know what a square was, the statement would not be self-evident. So if there was a person that didn't know what a square was, it wouldn't be self-evident to them that the square had four sides, but it would still be self-evident in itself, and it would be pretty easy to get that person to understand that it was self-evident, because we could quickly teach them what the definition of a square was. It's quite straightforward. Anselm wants to argue, so we're going back to Anselm, that a statement such as God exists is self-evident. His ontological argument is a way of arguing that existing must be part of the definition of God. That's what the whole thing about saying something than which nothing greater can be thought. If God is that, then he must exist. So it's part of his definition to exist. If this is correct, if it's part of the existence, if it's part of the definition of God that he exists, then it would be correct that God exists as a self-evident statement. Aquinas is arguing that God exists may be self-evident in itself. This means that if we truly knew what God is, we may know that it is part of the definition of God that he exists. In fact, he thinks that is likely to be the case. However, Aquinas argues that we do not know God completely. God is transcendent and our knowledge of him is very limited. Therefore, we cannot know enough about God. Sorry, typo there, it says that enough about God. We cannot know enough about God to know that God exists as self-evident. Instead, argues Aquinas, we must know God, another typo, by his effects through empirical evidence which we can know and understand. That is basically his argument. I hope that makes sense. Do let me know if it's unclear. Just making weird noises with my computer. Right. Next one. Okay, how would we respond to that from Anselm? Well, there's a couple of ways you can respond to it. It's a bit of a head scratcher, this one, I think, but there's some things you can say. Firstly, if Anselm's argument works, in other words, if the logic of the argument is sound, it does prove something, which is you could just take God out of it and just say, okay, let's just go with imagine something than which nothing greater can be conceived. Imagine something that you can't think anything better than. Now, if there were no other objections apart from Aquinas's, if, say, just imagine the logic of that argument worked completely, and Aquinas was an objection, then you could say, well, Anselm has proved something. He's proved that there is a being, the being that you can think no greater than exists. And you kind of, part of me thinks, well, if that was true, doesn't that help at least get us some way towards God's existence? Doesn't it help us, it seems to me somehow relevant to God's existence if we've proved that the greatest being we can think of does definitely exist. Because that does seem very similar to God. Now, Aquinas might say, yeah, but God's actually not the greatest being we can think of. God's actually beyond the greatest being we can think of. But what you could say is, well, if we've proved that there must be a being at least as great as anything we can think of, then it seems only another step to say that being is actually greater than anything we can think of. If that makes sense. So you're saying that there is at least the greatest being that we can think of. If we prove that, then it seems like we've made a step towards proving the existence of God, even if God is actually beyond anything we can think of. I hope that makes sense. The second one you could say is, well, look at Anselm's definition of God. He's just saying God is the greatest being, a being than that nothing greater can be conceived. It's being that nothing better can be thought of. Now, what you might say is, actually, this isn't saying that we know the definite essence of God. It's saying that God is something, we can't think of anything better than God. That's all it's saying about him. So I think it's possible to say that you accept Anselm's definition. God is a being than which we can think of nothing greater, but still say, but we don't know everything about him. We just know that about him. It's not like Anselm is giving a full definition of God. He's just saying we can't think of anything better than him. So I think if Anselm could have replied, he didn't reply. I can't quite remember how the dates match up here, but they didn't have a correspondence about it. But my point, Anselm could conceivably have said, I'm not saying that I know the definition of God, like in his totality. I'm not saying I know everything about him. I'm simply saying that God can be defined. This is one way in which we can define what God is, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, on top of that, anything could be true about God. He could be great in all these many different ways, but it's possible to say that definition of God could be true, and still that would allow God's transcendence to be maintained. Okay, I hope all that makes some kind of sense. It's a tricky one, I know. Let's look at the last thing. Yeah, all I want want you to do is take this stuff. I'll put the slides up on Teams. But I just want you to make sure that you can write an explanation of Aquinas' criticism. What does Aquinas say? Why does he think Anselm's wrong? And then write a full explanation of one way in which Aquinas' criticism could be challenged. So take one of those two and kind of expand it a little bit. Those two from the last slide, and kind of explain how could Anselm or a supporter of Anselm answer back against what Aquinas says. Okay, that's it. Bye.